There were houses along the road and people sitting out on their chairs and so forth, just enjoying the sunshine. There was beautiful weather. And the water was coming to the back of these buildings. They couldn't see the water. And so we yelled to them, the flood is coming, get out of here. I mean, that type of thing. I remember one man was very upset and swore at us like crazy. We shouldn't be scaring people like that. Anyway, he walked to the end of the house and looked and saw the water. He gave a yell, and I don't know what happened from then on because I was too busy pedaling my bicycle to get out of there.
Prior to the 20th century, the Columbia River was a wild, undammed river. Prone to frequent seasonal floods, the river had a life and rhythm of its own. In the early 20th century, a few small dams were built, but these had little effect on the river as a whole. As part of President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, construction on two massive dams on the Columbia River, the Grand Coulee and the Bonneville, was undertaken in the 1930s. The dams were built primarily for the production of hydroelectric power, while the Grand Coulee was also intended to provide irrigation to adjacent areas in eastern Washington. Industrialist Henry J. Kaiser was one of the prime contractors in the building of the Grand Coulee and Bonneville dams. Early in World War II, Henry Kaiser became involved in the building of ships for the British government as part of their war effort. By the time the U.S. entered the war, Henry Kaiser had the connections to land large U.S. shipbuilding contracts. Eventually, 7 Kaiser shipyards were established during the war on the West Coast to build mostly victory ships. 3 of these were located in the Portland area, 2 in Portland, including one on Swan Island, and 1 in Vancouver, Washington. An influx of workers for shipbuilding and the war industry helped bring about housing shortages in Portland early in the war. A housing authority of Portland was created not long after the attack on Pearl Harbor, but a lack of federal housing funds through early 1942 left the city unable to build sufficient new housing. Henry Kaiser couldn't wait, so he appealed to the United States Maritime Commission for funding to build the most spectacular of all wartime housing projects. With $26 million in approved funds, he built his own city, Kaiserville, which later came to be known as Vanport. The project was built in the floodplain of the Columbia on 650 acres of reclaimed land. The city, effectively a housing project, was located at the present site of Delta Park, Portland International Raceway, and the Heron Lakes Golf Course. It was the largest housing project in the United States and quite likely the world at the time. Located in the floodplain, it was surrounded on 3 sides by dikes and on the 4th side by a railroad berm, built in 1907. Because it was originally intended to provide only temporary housing, buildings were simply made of wood and set on wooden foundations. The entire project was conceived, designed, and built in the span of 1 year. There was just one entrance to Vanport at Denver Avenue. The first residents of Vanport moved in December 1942. At its peak, it was said to be the second largest city in Oregon with close to 40,000 residents. Prior to 1940, there were fewer than 1,800 African Americans residing in the entire state of Oregon. A large percentage of the war workers recruited into Portland were African American. While Vanport effectively segregated the burgeoning black population from much of the rest of Portland during the war, life within Vanport provided the opportunity for further integration than was occurring elsewhere in Portland and the rest of Oregon. Approximately 40% of the population of Vanport was African American during the war, with schools, churches, and recreational facilities integrated. The first black teachers and policemen in the state of Oregon were hired in Vanport. However, it was still not completely integrated. The hospital was segregated, and for the most part, so was housing. After the war, the population dropped rapidly as many wartime workers left. However, in their place, veterans began to move in. At the time of the flood, the population had stabilized at around 18,500 residents. To help prepare residents for the post-war economy, Oregon funded the Vanport Extension Service, which was the predecessor to Portland State University. By volume, the Columbia River is the largest river in North America draining into the Pacific Ocean. Stretching over 1,200 miles from its headwaters in southern British Columbia to its mouth on the Oregon-Washington state line, the river drains over 250,000 square miles. Some of the larger tributaries into the Columbia include the Kootenai River, the Pend d'Oreille, the Spokane River, the Columbia's largest tributary, the Snake, and the Willamette River. The Columbia discharges on average 265,000 cubic feet per second into the Pacific Ocean. Late spring flooding in 1948 would produce 4 times that flow. The winter of 1947 to 1948 over the Pacific Northwest was not particularly remarkable. When measurements of the snowpack across the region were made on April 1st, water content in the Columbia River Basin ranged from above normal across southern British Columbia, western Montana, northern Idaho, eastern Washington, and northern Oregon to a little below normal over southeast Oregon and southern Idaho. On April 1st, forecasts from the Soil Conservation Service, the Weather Bureau, and the Department of Lands and Forest Water Rights Branch, British Columbia, all indicated an outlook for high spring runoff that could result in high river stages. This was based on an assumption of near normal rainfall for April through June. For a scenario of precipitation near the record maximum, the Weather Bureau indicated flows considerably above normal, but, with the exception of the Spokane, nowhere approaching the record maximum. While there was nothing to suggest floods of a great magnitude at that point, the weather from mid-April through mid-June proved critical in changing the situation. From mid-April through mid-May, the weather was abnormally cold and wet, adding to the snowpack over much of the basin at a time when it normally begins to diminish. From mid-April through mid-May, the mean flow pattern at 300 millibars, about 5.5 miles high, showed a steering current for incoming storms that originated over the Bering Sea. This brought abnormally cold and wet weather to the Pacific Northwest, adding to the snowpack over the northern part of the basin and delaying the snow melt over the southern part of the basin. The second half of May brought a distinct change in the weather pattern. A steering flow from mid-May to mid-June at 300 millibars brought systems up from the south-southwest, with systems coming in from the much warmer Pacific off the California coast. A pattern of above-normal precipitation, but with much warmer temperatures, was the result. This in turn initiated a period of rapid snowmelt throughout the Columbia River Basin.
The weather conditions leading up to this flood were really interesting. I tend to think of floods that we have in the wintertime, anytime from November through March, as primarily being driven by heavy rain, and floods that we have in the springtime more being about snowmelt. I think looking at this event, what you find out is it's not that clear cut. That snowmelt definitely was a big factor in this flood event. We had a large snowpack above normal, especially in the northern part of the Columbia Basin up into Canada. We continued to build that snowpack all the way into early May, and then in mid-May we saw a big change in weather conditions and a rapid warm-up, and we quickly melted a lot of that snow. But another big part of that scenario was that we also had quite a bit of rain along with those warmer temperatures in May. And so this was a flood where snowmelt was definitely a much larger component than what we typically see here in the wintertime. But rainfall was also a big component of what led to this historic flood on the Columbia River.
By the 1st of May, Weather Bureau and Soil Conservation Service forecast recognized the likelihood of damaging spring floods. The Weather Bureau in its water supply forecast for the Columbia Basin stated, by and large, April precipitation over the Columbia Basin was unusually large, and runoff forecasts have been modified upwards very considerably over most of the area. The Clark Fork, Pend Oreille, Spokane, and Clearwater basins are forecast to have very large runoffs, exceeding in places the maxima of record. Flood hazards have increased on the Clark Fork, Pend Oreille, the Spokane and its tributaries, the Clearwater, the Kootenai, and the main stem of the Columbia River. Flooding troubles first occurred on May 20th with flash flooding along Moses Creek in northeast Washington. Several miles of track and bridges of the Great Northern Railway were washed out with the loss of one life. In the following week, flood issues multiplied on the Columbia River and its northern tributaries. On May 23rd, the first dike failure occurred along the Kootenai River in Idaho. Peak flows on the Flathead River and Clark Fork in Montana were reached, while Catherine Creek flooded parts of the town of Union, Oregon. On May 27th, the Columbia overflowed its banks at Hanford, Washington, and 5,000 persons were evacuated. Just how high the Columbia would rise and how fast was unknown. Weather Bureau forecast issued on the 25th of May for the Columbia River at Vancouver called for river levels to hold just over 23 feet through the 29th of May. In Vanport, the Housing Authority of Portland began routine patrols of the north and south dikes as water levels approached those of a flood 2 years earlier. Patrols were later increased to include the West Dike. The Housing Authority communicated with the Army Corps of Engineers regarding the structural integrity of the dikes and reported they had 47,000 sacks of sand, 150 trucks, and a standby crew of at least 50 men available. In the ensuing days, the river continued to rise, and so the forecast also had to rise. By the 28th of May, forecasts were calling for the river to reach 30 feet by the 1st of June. Meanwhile, the Housing Authority went to 24-hour-a-day operations. With the Columbia rising rapidly, Sandbagging and the building of temporary dikes was going on seemingly everywhere. By the 28th, flooding had become widespread, not just along the main stem of the Columbia and its northern tributaries, but also in the Fraser and Skeena River basins in British Columbia. Late May and early June flooding of the Fraser River severed the two Canadian transcontinental rail lines, inundated the Trans-Canada Highway, and breached 12 diking systems to flood over 50,000 acres. In the U.S., peaks were reached on the Flathead and Bitterroot Rivers in Montana and the St. Joe River and the Kootenai River at Bonners Ferry in Idaho. 7 miles of mainline Great Northern Railway were underwater near Kootenai, and 40,000 acres of diked land was flooded. On the lower Columbia, shipyards at Washougal, Camas, Vancouver, and Ridgefield, Washington were shut down, with the Camas-Washougal port under 5 feet of water. On May 29th, the Columbia River Highway between the Dalles and Cascade Locks, Oregon, was closed, and 1,400 people were evacuated near Vancouver, Washington. A meeting of the Red Cross, the Housing Authority of Portland, and local governments was held on the 29th, where the possibility of an evacuation of Vanport was discussed. The Housing Authority reported they had emergency housing for 1,500 people available, with the Red Cross indicating they had housing for an additional 7,500 people. There was no decision made regarding an evacuation. Another meeting was scheduled for Monday, May 31st. Around 4 a.m. on the 30th, a sheet of paper appeared under the door of each residence in Vanport. Intended to be reassuring, the note offered advice on actions residents should take. However, it did not necessarily produce a calming effect. It concluded with the statement, "Dikes are safe at present. You will be warned if necessary. You will have time to leave. Don't get excited." An investigation later revealed that it was prepared by a housing authority employee. Numerous sightseers gathered in areas adjacent to the Columbia River. As early as 10:30 a.m., a patrol found seepage on the railroad dike. Men were put to work within 30 minutes with sandbags, but messages throughout the day repeated there was no immediate danger.
3 of my buddies and I decided that we were going to go down and see the flood. The thing that we were so interested in was that at Jansen Beach, we had heard that the roller coaster was completely standing in water. So we decided that we would go down and see this thing. We didn't think water would ever get that high. So we started off from our house and got on our bicycles, and we rode down through Vanport over to Jansen Beach and saw the roller coaster that was in the water, but there wasn't much else to see, and so we decided we'd go home.
At 4 p.m., the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers reported that the ground level of Vanport was 15 feet below the level of the Columbia River and Smith Lake. At 4:17 p.m., a break occurred in the railroad berm on the west side of Vanport. A wall of water 10 feet high roared through the break, knocking down buildings near Vanport College. Students and faculty working to remove school records at the time scattered throughout Vanport to warn others of the impending flood.
We ran onto a drugstore, and so we went in to get candy. And I remember instead of getting candy, I got sunflower seeds. And just as I paid for the sunflower seeds, the air raid sirens went off. Now, these were very loud. Now, this really spooked us, and so we went out to find out what in the world was going on. There was a police officer in the middle of the street directing traffic, and we saw an elderly lady walk up to him and ask him what the sirens were for. And he said, "Lady, the dike has broken. Get to high ground." So we started riding down the street, And it wasn't long before we got to the place that we caught up with the cars ahead of us. We were able to go faster than the cars. So we swung out and started to go on the side of the road. And as soon as we swung out, we realized we could see the water coming from the dike. We were heading straight toward the dike that broke. To get where we wanted to go, we had to go about a half a block more toward the dike. We started pedaling just as fast as we could pedal, and not realizing we could pedal. The bikes would go that fast.
The first waves of floodwaters initially filled up the sloughs around Vanport. This process took over a half an hour, providing a crucial window of time in which many residents were removed from danger. Taxis and numerous buses from the Portland Traction Company arrived to aid in the evacuation efforts. Once the sloughs had filled, waves washed through the rest of Vanport all the way to near Denver Avenue on the east side of town, flooding cars and tearing houses from their foundations. Within a couple of hours of the break, a gauge on the Willamette River indicated the river had dropped 3 inches as a result of the water flowing into Vanport.
What you had once those houses were lifted off of that wooden foundation, then with the water coming in so fast and swirling, houses were just floating and moving, and there were people on top of the roofs. And so, yeah, it was just a matter of 40 minutes, maybe an hour and 40 minutes from the time we got out and standing up on there, and Vanport was no more. It was just totally destroyed. Everything in it was gone.
Boats were called in to rescue people stranded on roofs and the upper floors of the buildings. The sheriff's office implemented a more organized search for survivors in the evening, and by 9 p.m. it was believed that none were left stranded in Vanport. The Red Cross established an emergency headquarters in downtown Portland, and numerous area schools, churches, and civic buildings were set up to house refugees.
That we heard all this noise of people running through the dorm that kept yelling, "Help! We need help! We need help!" And so we finally went to the door and we said, "What do you mean by..." Said, "Well, we need all the people we can get to set up some army camps in all the churches and all the schools here in North Portland." Oh, well, that's no problem. So we went out and we went from church to school to church to school, setting up army cots. And we worked all night long. And early the next day, we finally got back to the campus and we just collapsed. We put a register in every church and every school that we were in that night. Mm-hmm. And these people were wandering from one church to the next school to the next church, seeing, because we made everybody make sure that they signed their names if they were staying there all night. And so this went on for some time, and these people would come in there and they would look on the list and, "Oh," they said, "Joe and Alice are here." And then they would reunite. So that was very nice. Yeah. And so then, it was just more and more people. But I'll tell you, we had set up so many army cots, I didn't want to see one again.
Yeah.
Many private citizens also opened up their homes to provide emergency housing. National Guard troops arrived and aided in a search for casualties late Sunday night and Monday. The initial search did not yield any fatalities. Concern over the safety of the berm on which Denver Avenue was built grew during the day Monday. As a Portland General Electric Company vehicle traveled down Denver Avenue, the berm collapsed, submersing the vehicle and killing the lone driver, becoming the first confirmed casualty of the Vanport flood. The gap quickly widened, allowing some Vanport buildings to float east of Denver Avenue. In the end, it was determined that the Vanport flood claimed 15 lives. It was also acknowledged by the Multnomah County Coroner's Office that there may have been other victims whose bodies were never located. At 6:30 p.m. May 31st, the Columbia River at the Dalles hit a maximum flow of 1,010,000 cubic feet per second. Imagine 180,000 filled bathtubs going by every second. Backwater from the Columbia pushed the Willamette River at Portland to a peak stage of 29.95 feet just before noon on June 1st. Floodwaters reached Union Station. The Army Corps of Engineers ordered a mass evacuation of both sides of the Columbia River below Portland. The Lewis River in Washington, backed up by the Columbia, threatened the town of Woodland with a flood similar to Vanport. The Corps of Engineers suspended river traffic below Portland. They were concerned that waves caused by boats might break through the dikes, which were already nearly overtopped and softened by the prolonged period of high water levels. On June 2nd, the dikes failed in the already evacuated town of Woodland, Washington. 8 feet of water flooded the business district. Also, on the 2nd, Pacific Telephone and Telegraph's cable crossing the Columbia between Portland and Vancouver broke. Along much of the Columbia, the river remained at or near its peak flow for 2 weeks through the 12th of June. Localized storms on the 9th through the 11th produced flash flooding in northeast Oregon and eastern Washington, with especially severe impacts along Black Horse Creek, Butter Creek, and 30 Mile Creek in Oregon, and Pine Canyon and Moses Creek in Washington. On the 11th, a dike broke 2 miles west of the Portland airport, flooding 10,000 acres, including the airport. Water stood up to 10 feet deep in the main passenger and office buildings. During the night of the 13th and the 14th, the peak stage on the Willamette River at Portland was reached at 29.98 feet, while the Columbia River at Vancouver crested at 31 feet, which was 15 feet above flood stage. Through the rest of June, the river slowly receded, finally dropping below flood stage in July.
To me, it's interesting that we call this flood the Vanport Flood because it really affected much of the Pacific Northwest, up and down the Columbia River, all the way from the Canadian border down to the mouth of the Columbia River at Astoria. But in spite of all of that area that was affected, this flood has come to be known as the Vanport Flood. It was never rebuilt, and many lives were lost. Many people lost everything that they owned in the flood, and you just don't see that kind of impact in most of the floods that we have here in the Pacific Northwest.
Vanport ceased to exist after May 30th. The entire population was forced to relocate, which effectively started the process of racial integration in the city of Portland. Vanport College, the college that wouldn't die, relocated to the southwest part of downtown Portland. It eventually became Portland State University, the university with the largest enrollment of graduate and undergraduate students in the state of Oregon.
The Vanport Flood of 1948 is one of the exceptional floods in our history here in the Pacific Northwest and in the Portland area. Some of the other big floods that we think of are February of 1996, December of 1964. Then, of course, you can go back into the late 1800s, 1861, 1894, some of the other big floods that we've had historically.
The volume of water coming down the Columbia River during the historic 1948 flood has not been matched since. This is at least in part attributable to changes made in how the river is monitored and even controlled. In subsequent years, the 1948 flood was responsible for several key changes to how the threat of flooding is handled.
Out of the 48 flood, there came the motivation to provide river forecasting services for the Columbia Basin, and the Northwest River Forecast Center was formed at least in part as a result of the 1948 Vanport Flood.
In late 1949, the National Weather Service created the Northwest River Forecast Center in Portland. Its primary mission is to save lives and decrease property damage in the Columbia River Basin by the issuance of flood warnings and river stage forecast. By actively developing and incorporating scientific methodologies into the river forecast process, vast improvements have been made in river forecasting capabilities. Forecasts made by the River Forecast Center are the primary guidance used by local weather service forecast offices in the issuance of flood watches and warnings.
So what is the legacy of the Vanport Flood? There were a lot of things that came out of this flood event. How we viewed water management in the Columbia Basin changed drastically after this flood. For one thing, it heightened awareness of the need for safe levees and dikes to protect areas that are near the river. Prior to 1948, really the emphasis of dams being operated in the Pacific Northwest was to provide water for irrigation and also to provide hydroelectric power. Then that hydroelectric power supported a lot of the war-related industrial development here in the Pacific Northwest. Aluminum plants were built. There was just a lot of large industrial construction throughout the Pacific Northwest that was really dependent on this new source of electricity. So after 48, it was recognized that not only do we need dams for irrigation and hydroelectric power, but also we need them for flood control.
In 1950, the United States Congress passed the Flood Control Act of 1950, which authorized flood control projects in Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. This led to a handful of new dams for flood control in the Columbia River Basin, including the Priest Rapids Dam, John Day Dam, and the Dalles Dam. Dam building continued in later years. Several projects were completed in British Columbia to help regulate flow, including the Mica Dam, which was authorized by the Columbia River Treaty in 1961. After the Vanport Flood, the Army Corps of Engineers also began to actively regulate the flow of the river to minimize flood flows. Given the changes and advancements in weather and river forecasting and the regulation of the flow of the Columbia, it is natural to wonder if such a flood could happen again.
So let's suppose that we had the same weather conditions now that we had in 1948. My expectation is that we would not see the magnitude of flooding that we saw in 1948 because of the water management that's in place, some of the large flood control reservoirs that were put in Canada and in the United States after that 1948 flood. I think with the presence of those reservoirs, it's likely that the peak flow and the amount of flooding would be much lower in the Portland area, Portland and Vancouver, than what we saw in 1948.
With all of the significant improvements in river monitoring, modeling, controlling, and forecasting, the likelihood of seeing another flood on the Columbia as significant as the flood of 1948 seems remote. However, as shown by more recent floods, such as those in February of 1996, floods will continue to be a part of life along the Columbia River and along the many other rivers and streams of the Pacific Northwest.